that we see that this isn't a waste of money and human resources. What's lacking now is a sense of urgency and sense of will, and someone, it's not a me, it's a we issue, that can expand the moral imagination of this country so that we can deal with this unjust system.
Okay. Thank you. Yes. So you just mentioned Newark and that being your home and your community. And you're one of the few candidates who I know has been in an executive role in government, that is being the mayor of a city and the mayor of Newark, New Jersey. And in this whole context of brothers and sisters who get arrested and get harassed or even suffer violence at the hands of police, many times, in my opinion, and the research shows, this is based in the policies around who gets stopped, where you set up traffic stops, what's the policy of your department around policing certain communities. It's even now gotten to a place that there are tech companies developing algorithms to give the law enforcement departments around where they should stop people, who they should stop. And what we see as a result of this is a disproportionate number of black and brown people who get stopped by police for doing nothing or without much probable cause. One of my favorite hip hop groups is Brand Nubian, and they had a song called Probable Cause that talked about that it's easy to get pulled over and they don't really have probable cause, but they make up probable cause. And we know the evidence of stop and frisk in New York City during the same time that you were mayor of Newark, New Jersey. So can you talk about what you did as mayor to mitigate the racial disparity and who gets stopped and pulled over and frisked, and what should we be doing about that as a nation, and what could you do as president?
No, I'm loving you giving me the opportunity to talk about this, because we didn't do enough in my early years. You know, we came in and inherited a police department with decades of pattern and practices challenges, and we said, okay, we're going to go about, in fact, we said publicly our number one thing is going to be police integrity, and we did some things, but we were not dealing nearly enough. And it wasn't until the DOJ came in and did the right thing, which is we're going to do a deep dive collection and analysis of the data. And we started seeing from the data they were collecting that we were perpetuating the biases in our police department that had existed for years before that.
Wow. And
took on a very aggressive plan to change, partnered with the ACLU to do national standard setting transparency methods to try to clean up an issue. And that's why I tell people all the time, the DOJ has a major role to play in this, because here was a black city with black mayors, with black police leaders, but was still seeing rippled throughout its system was disparities in stops, frisks, rights being violated. And so as a mayor, I now know, I learned the hard way. By my second term, we had to completely look to transform the way we were addressing these issues with more speed and more effort. And this is big when you're an executive. I think it's one of the best lessons I got in my life, that I can't do it all alone. We had to reach out to a whole bunch of partners to get this done. It's why when I went to become a senator that I started introducing bills to say that, look, one of the biggest things the federal government has a responsibility to do is to hold law enforcement accountable. And if I'm president of the United States, right away we're getting the DOJ back into doing just that. And looking to push legislation that's going to force better reporting of police tactics. We don't even have a fair and accurate reading of police use of force cases in the United States of America. And so unless something's being caught on videotape, and we know for every videotape that's captured, every name that we know, from Tamir Rice to Garner, every name that we know, there are thousands we don't know.
Correct.
Because we don't have the accountability systems built in. And so as President of the United States, as a guy who himself was stopped by police, and himself knows the fear and indignities of what that all is involved, I'm going to be very urgently working with legislatively through the DOJ and through the Department of Education. The Department of Education has a civil rights division that should be working in schools to deal with disparities. That is not police, although police are being called into our schools more often, but it's school discipline. We know that children who are suspended from school have much higher rates of involvement with the police, and there's disproportionate suspensions for African American kids when they control for the actual infraction. African American kids are dramatically more likely to be out of school suspended for those things. So this is I will be a president that is like I was when I was a United States Senator, because it's nice to talk about issues of diversity and the like, but let me give you an example of, as a fourth black person ever elected to the United States Senate, When I got to the Senate, it was the least diverse place I'd ever seen.
Wow.
I mean, I just couldn't find the minorities who were working. I went and looked at the Judiciary Committee and I couldn't find black staffers.
Wow.
And so I went to Chuck Schumer with Brian Schatz and just said, it's about accountability. It's what I said, the DOJ forcing statistics to come out in the open. I said, can we get every Democratic senator who's being elected by diverse groups have to publish the diversity statistics of their staff? And guess what happened when people started publishing the diversity statistics? Now that they know there's going to be accountability, the numbers of minorities and women being hired in the United States Senate have gone up. And so, as President of the United States, I know a Judiciary Committee making laws that disproportionately affect minorities should have people of color on it. But administration, we should be creating more transparency, more accountability in police departments, in education systems, to make sure that we bring to light the disparities that are still rife within our society: gender disparities, discrimination against Americans with disabilities, discrimination, religious discrimination. Stop and frisk is not just an issue for African Americans, it's for Muslim Americans, it's for Latino Americans. And so we have a lot of work to do, but I'm gonna be a president that pushes all of this stuff to have to the light and force there to be more accountability in our country.
Great. Thank you. We're gonna be prepared to take questions from the audience in just a second, but I wanna shift to sentencing reform. In the mid-1980s, the American prison population was 330,000. Today, it's over 1.5 million in prison. Now, some people would like to tell you that this is the case because of more crime, that more people are committing crime, when the evidence shows that it's the policies that have driven our prison population to be that number. Mandatory minimum, 3 strikes law, and you got to do 25 years, you got to do life sentences. And so we have more people serving more than 20 years in federal prison now than we've ever had at any point in time in history. And it's tough on crime mentality. So as president, would you consider exploring methods that are used in some other countries around the world, like Norway and Germany, who says there's a maximum, 20 years, and that's it. So there's no 40-year, 50-year, 300-year sentences as a policy. So how do you think about that as a presidential candidate, someone that might be president, what we can do to deal with mandatory minimum?
Right, and so this is what I'm talking about. This is not some issue I've just been focusing on since I've been running for president. Okay. I've been dealing with this since I was on a college campus writing about these issues in my college newspaper. So I've looked at comparative studies of incarceration around this planet. We are in a shameful reality. One of my friends who's law school classmates, who's now head of the Vera Institute, has actually taken American leaders in incarceration, wardens, over to look at how other prisons are doing things and how it's dramatically lowered the violence involving correctional officers, keeping them safer, and just by practices that are going on in prison. You see, we have this de facto retribution, awful feeling in this country that somehow, that we must be a country that the longer the mandatory minimum, the more justice. And that is just not true. And it causes us to do things that hurt our society, like pulling Pell Grants away from people in prison. Now think about that. I've heard people say to my face, well, I don't want my tax dollars going to letting people get college degrees. Well, I'm like, the number one, your tax dollar invested in education in prison saves you 4 to 5 tax dollars in lowering recidivism rates. It's this counterintuitive reality that the more compassionate you often are, the more likely you're to create a safer, more just society. And so mandatory minimums, I don't need to look overseas. I think we need to completely get rid of them or get to the point in America where this is something we did through the First Step Act, where judges are getting more leeway and latitude to go away from mandatory minimums. And I've already put forth legislation called the Second Look Act that says if you have been in prison for more than 10 years, somebody should look at your sentence and see what's going on here. And so this is what I'm saying about, I hope I'm the nominee. But if I'm not the nominee, I'm going to be all over that nominee. Because I cannot tolerate when we know factually, this is what I'm challenging the field. Not one person has taken me up on this yet. We know factually there are about 17,000 people unjustly incarcerated. How do we know this? Well, 87 members of the Senate just voted on a bill to lower those mandatory minimums. And so now think of the injustice if you were sentenced the day before that bill, you have a sentence that could be 10 years longer than the day after that bill.
Wow.
By not making it retroactive, we've created an unjust disparity in incarceration. Well, those people factually are in on law, on terms that the Senate has said bipartisan way are wrong. Those people should be eligible for clemency. So I could go through a lot of other examples of crack cocaine, powder cocaine disparity. Yeah. There's no difference in that chemical. And so people who are incarcerated still at the 18-to-1 levels are unjustly incarcerated. How can the country that professes that we are a nation that is a sacrosanct ideal, liberty, have so many people that are unjustly incarcerated? And so as President of the United States, I am going to tear down this unjust system of mass incarceration. And I'm going to make it a national mission. And as we know, states that have done reforms that have lowered their prison populations, guess what's happened to crime? It's gone down. States that are there for people to come home from prison with rapid attachment to work and housing cut recidivism rates. Right. This is not complicated about what it's going to take to make us a safer, stronger, more fiscally responsible country. It's not difficult. It's not complicated. What we need is that the next president has a driving will to get the work done.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience, and I see a hand in the back here. If you could please stand up, tell us your name and your question.
And you look like you're a student.
I am. Good morning. I'm Courtney Ingram, and I am a senior here at Benedict College. Yesterday, we got to see an exclusive screening of Just Mercy. And in the great words of great Brian Stevenson, we have a criminal legal system that treats you better if you are rich and guilty than if you are poor and innocent.
That treats you better, yes.
Our bail system is not only broken, it unjustly favors those with means. Today, we have thousands of people who languish in cages every day awaiting to have their day in court simply because they cannot afford to pay bail. As president, how would you remove the profit motives from our criminal legal system?
So as president, I'm going to end private. Thank you, Courtney.
Good question.
Thank you, Courtney. And Courtney, it's one of the best books I've read in the last 5 years is Just Mercy. And then I listened to it on Audible book because Brian Stevenson reads it himself, and it is so moving. And I really recommend you reading the book as well. The profit motive in this system is so wrong, and that's why the bail system is broken. That's why private prisons, I will end them. And we are a nation that has debtor prisons, and it's just unjust and unacceptable. Where people are in prison right now today as we sit here being tortured, I'll get back to that in a second. There are people being tortured in prisons today that they are there just because they can't afford to get out. And if that does not get all of us angry and motivated to do something about this, then we are not the country we say we are. And so as President of the United States, this is a big issue for me, that we strip the profit motives out of this system and not have people profiting off of the incarceration, that we end debtors' prisons and we stop criminalizing poverty. Now, when I said that we torture people in our prisons, is that we do things to people in prison that other countries consider torture. The story of Kalief Browder is another documentary that you should watch, and he is not an anomaly, but the story of Kalief Browder is a story of a young man that was incarcerated for stealing a backpack, was in prison well over a year, if I remember correctly, 2 years, waiting for his trial, kept refusing to plead guilty, and they kept finding outrageous ways to keep holding on to him. And while he was in prison, he was tortured because juvenile solitary confinement by our psychological professionals in this country, and clearly people outside of this country, consider that torture. It does permanent psychological harm. Kalief Browder eventually committed suicide when he was outside of prison. These are practices that go on in America today. The shackling of pregnant women while they're giving birth. These are practices that are going on today. The denial of prisoners basic medical care. It's why one of the most recent bills I put in is to expand Medicaid coverage to people that are in prison. All of these practices are ones that we should expose. Menstrual equity. We have women in prison who have been telling me about making their own tampons because they can't afford to buy them. They have to make the choice of whether to call their children because we have prisons today that charge usury rates just to make a telephone call. There are so many things that are going on in our prisons that should shock the consciousness of this country, but we're not talking about them and exposing them enough to get the kind of moral movement to end them. And again, as your president, as a person who has been visiting prisons since he was in law school, even as I hope one of the questions they ask every presidential candidate is, you're talking about this during your presidential campaign, have you gone to a prison during your presidential campaign and listened to prisoners who can't vote because we have a system that strips away people's citizens' rights for doing things that 2 of the last 3 presidents admitted to doing? And so I am determined to tear down this broken system and make sure that we have a system that's about justice and not torture.
So I think thank you very much. So we just got time for a couple more. So there's a hand right here up the front, and then this young lady over here will be our final question. So, and I'm gonna tell you, this is a special question you're about to get right here.
All right.
This is one of my most important mentors,
really,
leaders in the state legislature,
all
and
right.
I'm gonna let her introduce herself.
Okay, that's enough. Thank you so much. Thank you. Is this on?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Gilda Cobb-Hunter. I'm a member of the South Carolina House, and I'm president of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators, my former colleague, Anton Gunn. Senator, first, thank you for your opening comments. Thank you for having the courage and the respect for this institution to come here and say it. I just want to say that to you. My question is this: as one of the primary sponsors of the Opportunity Zone, as president, what would you put in place that would allow for the sustainable reentry of inmates or formerly incarcerated returning citizens? Because we've had a lot of conversation about the barriers that returning citizens face. What would you do to put in place some really sustainable long-term solutions to help in that situation? And if you would, let me just end by saying I really appreciate your attention to the systemic issues. I appreciate what you said about DOJ. And if at some point you want to offer specifics about what you would do to undo the damage that this president has done as far as enforcement authority for DOJ. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Representative, I'm going to try to be as brief as possible because I'm conscious of the time. You mentioned opportunity zones, a bill I wrote underneath President Obama. I didn't know that it was going to be enforced under President Trump. It is a phenomenal piece of legislation that doesn't have the accountability provisions that I will put into place, but already it's doing a lot of things to help HBCUs. A lot of our opportunity zones are in HBCUs. A fund has been started to help them. I'm all about pushing resources and opportunity to those who are not typically getting the resources and opportunity. Reentry, which is a huge topic, and again, I would love that everybody who's running for office talk about what they've been doing on reentry. Reentry is an issue I've been working on since I was mayor, and I saw what worked. We did a lot of things. We saw things that worked well, there are things that worked really well, and some that didn't work as well. And some of the key things that need to be funded are those best practices that we now know. There are things that we know that if we fund, it saves taxpayer money, and it keeps our communities safer. Because someone who comes home from prison and can't get housing, can't get a job, often will fall back into those habits or behaviors that cause them to get arrested in the first place. And so you can be confident with me that we will find ways to more fully fund and expand those examples of successful reentry programs that work: rapid attachment to work, housing opportunities. Here's something that those of you who really know these issues know. It is an outrageous challenge for men and women coming home just to get identification, birth certificates, and the kind of things that they need often to even apply for jobs. And so there's ways of doing those things. This is something I know intimately. I've been working on it as a practitioner, and as President of the United States, I will deal with this in a comprehensive, detailed way and find ways to use my funding streams to states. This is it's carrot and a stick here. In the same way they use the carrot and sticks to get states to engage in mass incarceration, I will begin to give grants to states that will change their laws and begin to make streams of federal resources contingent upon them doing, or they'll lose those streams of revenue and resources as well. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we are beyond time. I want to thank Senator Booker for his time and coming to South Carolina and coming to Benedict College. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you.
message, and it's going to take both political parties to get us out. So I think we should give a round of applause to this college for being willing to be a forum for bipartisan discussion. I am sitting here wearing two different hats. On the one hand, I am here as the CEO of the Reform Alliance, which I will explain, but I also get to be the moderator. So I'm going to abuse my privilege as the moderator to tell you what the Reform Alliance is, and then I'm going to switch roles. I'm going to introduce my panel. But the Reform Alliance is yet another bipartisan effort to do something about the criminal justice system. It actually came out of the horrific mistreatment of a lot of people on probation and parole, most famously Meek Mill, who wound up getting a 4-year prison sentence for popping a wheelie while he was on probation. And this created the whole hashtag Free Meek movement. But Meek said from the very beginning, Meek Mill, the great rapper, this is not about me. He said, I'm one story, there's so many more stories. And a lot of people didn't believe it. But as he began to peel back the onion skin, something was exposed which even myself, as a criminal justice advocate, was not aware of. Which was that even though we have 2 million people who are locked up in jails and prisons, the biggest peacetime prison population in the history of the world times 2, there's an additional 4.5 million, 2 times more, who are on probation and parole and are stuck in this spider's web of catch-22s that a nun could not navigate without going back to prison a couple of times. In other words, people who are not even committing new crimes, who are trying to comply, find themselves unable to comply. And once that came to light, people like Jay-Z, people like Robert Smith, people like Robert Kraft, Michael Rubin, Clara Boussaid, Laura Arnold, Michael Novogratz, Dan Loeb, and others, people of extreme wealth, billionaires, said something has to be done. Twice as many people. People talk about mass incarceration. Mass supervision is twice as big and just as deadly. So we launched something earlier this year called the Reform Alliance. And I'm proud to be the CEO for the Reform Alliance, to get it started. And our first campaign is in Pennsylvania, as you will hear. But the reason I'm excited about the Reform Alliance is bipartisan. Robert Kraft might be Donald Trump's best friend. He's on the board. Jay-Z is not Trump's best friend. And he's on the board. And everybody in between. And something is happening in this country where people on both sides of the aisle, of all races, rich and poor, are realizing that something has to be done. It has to be done on a bipartisan basis to get us out of a situation where we have 6, almost 7 million people who are not free in the land of the free. And that's what we're going to talk about. So there is probably no better panel of people to discuss this issue than the panel that we have. I have had the great honor and privilege of working personally and closely with all three. And these are some of the frontline folks who've been fighting this battle. The first person we're going to hear from is the good brother Michael Mendoza. Michael Mendoza is now the head of the Cut 50 campaign, a bipartisan campaign, played a big role in passing the First Step Act that Cory Booker was referencing. But even before he ascended to that great title, he's somebody who has been an incredible advocate, pushing for parole reform and other reform in California. His own story, which I'll share with you, is extraordinary. We also have Representative Jordan Harris here from the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He has risen to leadership, not just technically, he's got some titles in the legislature, but morally and spiritually, stepping out again and again to help people who are behind bars to get on their way with the Clean Slate Act, and also to get help this year when it comes to probation and parole. His signature is his ability to build bridges across party lines at a time when it's almost impossible, and across racial lines, frankly. And so I'm very, very proud to have him here. And also, I'm here proud to be here with my colleague, Jessica Jackson. She and I actually helped to found the Cut 50 campaign almost 6 or 7 years ago now. She is the political director for the Reform Alliance, Her story is also incredible. She was one of the main architects of the campaign that got the First Step Act passed. And so when you're talking about bipartisanship, when you're talking about an issue like this, how you get real stuff done, how you solve real problems, away from all the political food fight, how do you make it happen? You couldn't have a better panel than this panel. So please give my panel a round of applause. Let me start with you.
Talk to me, man.
You know, this is a personal thing. You're a great advocate. We are one of the best that we've seen. You know how to get laws passed, how to bring people together. But you didn't start off as an advocate. You started off with this as a personal matter. Share your personal story first, and then I'm going to ask you about the politics. Let's talk about personal stuff first. Why do you personally care about this issue?
This issue is deeply important to me for several reasons. One, as a 15-year-old kid who was arrested, tried as an adult, and basically spent close to 2 decades in prison. My whole entire focus during that time was proving that I wasn't that 15-year-old kid anymore. At a time where it was so difficult to even earn a release. And I worked hard for my release. I worked hard to prove that I could deserve an opportunity to come home. However, I didn't feel that way because I came home to a lifetime parole. In California, lifetime parole still exists. And coming home to that, I'm a Southern California kid. My whole entire family lives in Southern California. However, I wasn't allowed to parole back home. Instead, I paroled to Northern California, where I knew nobody or nothing, except the Golden Gate Bridge. And at that time, when it was a time for me to be celebrating my family, I couldn't visit them. There was a 50-mile radius that exists to this day, that even if you cross 1 mile over, you'll be sent back to prison. So for me, this is a personal issue where I believe that we need to provide more opportunities for people who are on parole, who have been successful and did everything they could to come home and earn their release. Because those are the people that we want to intervene in their lives to make sure that they're successful upon their release. So this is a deep and personal issue.
Can you talk about, I think for a lot of people, this is completely off the radar. I mean, even people who care about criminal justice, who watch all the documentaries, people who know the numbers, people are passionate about it. This is almost the invisible part of the system. It's 2/3 of the system. 2/3 is people on probation and parole. What is so hard about it? Well, somebody's going to say, listen, at least you're not in prison. You should be happy. What is so tough about being on probation or parole?
So I would ask, just a question, how many people travel more than 50 miles for work or just to go see family? Upon release, I was confined to a 50-mile radius.
50 or 15?
50. So you're confined to a 50-mile radius. And if you want to go to a school that's over 50 miles, if you want to get a job that's over 50 miles, if you want to move to another county, they'll deny you. I've been denied both. I've been denied to go to a school that was outside a 50-mile radius. I had a great job opportunity in a different county, but because I have no family or close friends that are in that county, I was denied just to be transferred to a county. So these restrictions really get in the way of improving or taking advantage of any opportunity that will either help you get a better paying job, help you improve in one's education. Those are real barriers that you are confined to for a long period of time, for a lifetime when you're on parole.
A lot of times, I think when you hear, so-and-so came home, but he had to go back because he blew probation. So-and-so came home, she had to go back because she blew parole. I think most people assume they were out jacking cars, they were going back to selling drugs, they were doing something highly negative. Talk to us about the actual reality. The large majority of people who go back, they go back for non-crime technical violations. But nobody knows what that means. What's a non-crime technical violation? And how does somebody go back to prison if they're not committing new crimes? That makes no sense to most people. Talk about that aspect of it.
So your parole officer or probation officer, they can visit you at your home at any given moment without notice. And if you're at your job and they visit your home and you're not there, they expect you to come back just for that visit. And so you're stuck with having to tell your employer, look, my parole officer wants to come to house check. I need to leave to go do this house check. Imagine an employer who's hearing that, saying like, whoa, like, you're on parole? Did I forget to mention that? But it's a real thing where you have to go out of your way and jeopardize your employment, jeopardize most opportunities, just to have a house check. And if I didn't go to that house check, then he would have came to my job, arrested me for not showing up, and I would have been sent back to prison.
You know, some of these stories are heartbreaking because it's like a spider's web with catch-22s. You have to get a job. You have to keep the job. You have to be a job on time. At the same time, you have to visit your probation officer, who's on the other side of town. You might sit in that waiting room for 2 or 3 hours just to check in, and they say, okay, you're still breathing. What job can you get that's going to let you disappear for half a day every week? Plus, you got to pick your kids up. If you don't get to pick your kids up, you go back to prison for child endangerment. If you're late for the probation officer, you go back to prison for being late for that. If you lose your job, it becomes this incredible spider's web of catch-22s. They're like, a nun couldn't do. I mean, you show up late for a meeting and you go to prison. I was late here. I came here late. I mean, so, you know, talk about the psychological stress of waking up every day not knowing. You're not committing any new crimes. You're desperately trying to comply with everything. But you still could wind up in prison tonight. Just talk about that.
You know, coming home in the first place after 2 decades, it was the scariest thing ever. I made every plan I could to prepare and be successful. But the reality is, it's totally different for people coming home. You don't know what to expect until you're home. Then with the added pressure of conditions of parole or probation, where you can't wear this color, you can't wear that color, you can't hang out with these people, you can't go into that neighborhood, you can't go back to that county. There are just a lot of more added barriers onto an individual, man or woman coming home. When they're coming home to begin with, they have to start all over again. I had nothing to my name. I had nothing to own. So my whole entire survival mode was trying to figure out, how am I going to get a job? Who's going to hire me with my felony conviction? And it was to the point where I would take any job. And most jobs, good paying jobs, outside of the poor community I lived in, were over a 50-mile radius. And so psychologically, every time I would tell myself I would be denied a job, or I couldn't go to a job interview because I had to visit my parole officer, it just becomes a really difficult process emotionally and mentally. I'll be honest with you, Brian. Sometimes it was so difficult. At times I wish I was back in prison. However, I always tell myself, a lot of us who are formerly incarcerated like to say one thing, that my worst day out here is better than my best day in there. And so a lot of times we need to just remember that, despite how difficult it is, emotionally, mentally, that we as formerly incarcerated people have a job to do out here. And that's to show the rest of the entire world that we're not just inmates, we're not just parolees, but we are human beings that have so much things to offer. So mentally and emotionally it's draining, but I think because of so many people who are supportive of us out here, and we can tap into that, it becomes a huge emotional support that we can draw into.
Well said, well said. Before it's over, I'm going to come back up. You actually were able to get off a lifetime parole, which is very hard to do, and you become an incredible champion of a bill that might make even bigger changes. I want to come back to that, but I want to move on to Representative Jordan Harris, who's just emerged as such an extraordinary leader in this space, actually able to get stuff done. A lot of talk, a lot of protests, a lot of blog posts, a lot of tweets, not a lot of bills, not enough. You're somebody who people see as capable of getting actual things done. Why did you decide to take on, you did Clean Slate last year, and that was a big success in Pennsylvania. Why did you decide to take on this issue, and why do you think it's so critical to bring Republicans and Democrats together to get stuff done?
So first, let me thank this great university for having us here. Thanks to the 2020 group for organizing and for all of the sponsors who helped put this together. For me, it's simple. Criminal justice reform, in my view, is the civil rights issue of our time. I believe that we are at a watershed moment in our body politics, and I believe that 30 to 40 years from now, people are going to turn around and ask the question, where were you on criminal justice reform, and what did you do to help reform the system? And frankly, I think we need to go beyond calling it reform and calling it redesign, because the truth is, it was messed up from the beginning, because you can't really reform something that was intentionally broken. It's time to blow the whole thing up, redesign it, and put it back together, right? So that's the first thing for me, is that I look at criminal justice reform as that civil rights issue. I'm an everyday person who lives in the neighborhood that I grew up in. My mother still lives in the same house that she raised me in. I live about a 5-minute drive from her. So when you're an everyday person, you see everyday people every day having everyday problems. So when I see all of my homies that I went to school with, having an issue with the criminal justice system, while I've never been there, it gave me an insight on what some of those problems are. So, fast forward, Meek gets locked up. I'm from Philly. If you're from Philly, you like me. So, many of his family members came to me like, yo, what's going on? It's messed up, blah, blah, blah. And, the more and more you actually look into it, the more and more, I saw that this wasn't just about Meek Mills. But there are, hundreds of thousands of Robin Williams throughout Pennsylvania who are trapped.
That's his real name, is Robin.
That's his real name. Who are trapped in this cycle I call probation, the quicksand of the criminal justice system. Once you get in, it's hard to get out, and the more you try to get out, the more it pulls you back in. And here's what I mean by that. In Pennsylvania, right, there's something called technical violations, where any interaction with police officers can land you back in jail. Any interaction. Well, if you're a black or brown person living in America, living in many of our urban cities that are already over-policed, standing on the corner can get you an interaction with a police officer. So when you understand that just being who you are every day can get you an interaction with a police officer and land you back in jail, we have a problem.
Now when you say any interaction, you mean hello, officer?
Any interaction. You can get a traffic violation. As Meek did, you could break up a fight, not be the one fighting. You could break up a fight and still end up in front of a judge who can violate you. But it gets worse. You can get violated, right, by your probation officer, and you can sit in jail for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months or more waiting to get to a probation hearing for a judge to decide whether or not you actually violated. Now, I don't know about you, but for most people, if you miss work for a week, let alone 5 months, you done lost that job. Go home and stop paying rent at your apartment for 5 months and see aren't the locks changed. Not be able to pick up your children from school for 5 months. Not be able to pay your car note for 5 months and see what actually happens. We are setting people up in a system that we know many of them will not be able to work within. And then what happens is when we send them back, right, we blame them. We blame them. So for me, it's a systematic problem that we have to fix. And I want to be clear about that. It's systematic. So what does that mean? I don't care how good a judge is, how good a probation officer is, and we have many of them who are trying to do great work. But a broke system, regardless of how many good people you put in it, is going to give a broke product. So until we actually redesign probation, not just in Pennsylvania, but across this country, we're going to continue to see and have these problems.
Y'all clap for that. I'm sorry. Having lawmakers from the community who feel it the way that you feel it. You're not waiting for a lobbyist to tell you what you do. This is something you understand in your bones. So that's the passion that you bring to it from your experience. But you are somehow able to reach across and deal with people, because Pennsylvania, people think about Pennsylvania, and they think about Philadelphia. Pennsylvania is a red state with Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh in it.
Yes.
Okay? So you are somehow also able to reach out and to build bridges. Explain to us how it is that Delosier and all these people who you might even disagree with on many issues, you're arm in arm with on this one.
So the truth of the matter is, I don't have the luxury of only working with people that I like. And I want that to be clear for anybody. I don't we feel like we have the luxury. Well, let me be clear. If you're a brother or sister on probation or parole or stuck behind walls, trying to get out, trying to take care of your kids, trying to raise you don't care if it's a Democrat that helps you or a Republican that helps you. You want somebody to help you. We cannot forget that. We can't. And look, I'm a proud Democrat. I'm going to try to take the House back in my caucus. I'm a Democratic whip in my caucus. But I'm a black man first, and I'm going to do any and everything I can to advocate to liberate black and brown people who have been oppressed by this broken criminal justice system. So that's what's important. So for me, that means finding people who agree with me. Now, here's the thing. My office is on Point Breeze Avenue in South Philadelphia. You can get there from Point Breeze Avenue, or you can get there from 21st Street. I don't really care how you get there or what street you take. I just need you to meet me there. And I look at politics the same way. So I have a colleague named Cheryl Delosier. Cheryl Delosier is a middle-aged white woman from rural Cumberland County, Pennsylvania. I, a 35-year-old black man from South Philadelphia with a very large beard. I work on this beard, so y'all might be pregnant. Anyway, Cheryl and I have nothing in common on most days. When you look at her votes and you look at mine, many times they're different. But on this issue, we agree. And we've been able to work together in a bipartisan fashion. We got Clean Slate done 2 years ago, which is now a national model for how you seal criminal records. Since Pennsylvania did it, Utah has done it, and many states across the country are now starting to put these laws on their books. So Cheryl and I work together because we see the common goal at the end. We get there differently, but we see it. For example, we have another colleague, Mike Jones, who works with us, and Mike will tell you, I'm in favor of probation reform because I believe that Jesus Christ believes in a second chance. You know what my response is? Hallelujah, brother, and praise the Lord. Whatever it takes to get you to where I need you to be, I'm going to do it. And here's the other thing. We have to talk to our conservative friends about this. The truth of the matter is we are wasting taxpayer dollars putting people back into jail when they don't need to be there. In Pennsylvania, we spend $100 million a year on technical violations. $100 million. Our recidivism rate is 60%. That costs us $1.27 billion every single year. So the point is this. We have to find places of consensus on these issues that matter to us the most. And look, I'm going to fight with my Republican colleagues on other issues. We're going to disagree, and I will debate like hell on those issues. But on this one, if you're going to help me help my folk, if you're going to help me liberate people who have been oppressed by this system, on this issue, we will walk arm in arm together to get it done. Because the truth of the matter is, nobody can wait for us to get beyond the political football of the day. People are suffering right now. Mothers are not able to take care of their children because they can't become employed because they got to go see a probation officer. Fathers are not able to go to their children's basketball game and football game because they can't cross county lines to go and take care of their children. If you are too stuck on politics to understand that that is at the core of what we're supposed to do as leaders, then you should move out of the way and let folks who want to address the critical issues of our community address those issues. We have no time to play.
I want to move now to Jessica Jackson. The passion that if you look at this, you got a Latino brother, or Latinx. I'm supposed to say Latinos. Okay, everybody says different, so I'm saying listen. We got a Latino brother, we got an African American brother. Nobody's surprised yet. Nobody's stunned. They're passionate, they're eloquent, nobody's surprised yet. And now we have somebody that people might be surprised to hear from.
Jessica just real light-skinned. She just real light-skinned.
They're really like a light-skinned Swedish American. So before we get into the policy piece, which obviously you're one of the experts in the country, why are you here? Why? that might actually be useful. Why is somebody who's blonde, blue-eyed, grew up in the South, so passionate about this issue?
Yeah, well, first I think it's not fair to make me go after Michael and Jordan, so I'm going to get you back for that. So if you look at me today, and I think you're right, some people are interested in why would I be interested in this issue, and the truth is, before I became an attorney, before I became a mayor of a town, before I took the job as Chief Advocacy Officer at Reform Alliance, if you go back 15 years, I was a high school dropout, living in rural Georgia, who had just recently struggled through my own addiction issues, with a 2-month-old baby, standing in a courtroom in Georgia watching my husband go to prison. Now, what's even more surprising is he was pretty much just as white as me. You'd probably argue he gets a little more tan, but he was just as white as me. So this issue has grown so big. Mass incarceration has taken up so much space at this point and impacted so many people that even me, a blonde-haired white girl, was impacted by it. And it destroyed our lives. And I mean that with my full heart. It did compel me to go to law school. I'm grateful for that silver lining, but we lost our house. I ended up on food stamps. My daughter didn't have a relationship with her father for a very long time. It took our dignity, and it left me living in isolation. I was embarrassed to tell even some of my closest friends because I was worried about, the judgment that they would have for me being in that situation, being married to somebody in prison. And I remember, people would ask me, because you can't really play off that your husband's gone for 3.5 years, right? That kind of starts to get weird, especially down in the South where neighbors got to know everything you're doing every day. But people would ask me, and I'd say, oh, he's working in another state. I didn't tell him he was working for the Department of Corrections. But it was just so isolating, and this is really before, social media and internet and all of that. And I remember just sitting in my house filled with so much shame and so much doubt. I remember, considering if I could even be a mother to my daughter. So, this issue, it disproportionately impacts African American and Latinx people. But it really is impacting the entire country.
Look, I think it's important to recognize that. Give a round of applause for that. I think that you really don't know who's going through what. And you really don't know what's in the background of folks. But what my experience has been working on this issue with Jessica, with Mendoza, and with Representative Harris, is that this issue is impacting, when you talk about 7 million people right now, present tense, in jail, prison, probation, parole, 7 million people, they all have family members. They all have cousins, nieces, nephews, people they went to school with, pastors, etc. It's a very, very large number of people. Oh, hey, brother. It's a very, very large number of people who've been caught up in this and who know that what we're doing is wrong. There is not, however, a large number of people who know what to do about it and who know how fixable some of this stuff is. And Jessica happens to be one of the people who does. The work that she's done, along with Aaron Haney and other people, Lewis Reed, Topeka Sam, and give a whole long list, has been massively impactful. And one of the things that I've been most impressed by is your ability to build coalitions and to work in coalitions. I think people will be surprised at the number of organizations on the left and the right that have come together to try to get something done. Can you talk a little bit about the structure of this kind of left-right alliance that is formed? It started with the Obama administration, honestly, trying to help Obama get a bill passed, but it has persisted now and helped Trump get a bill passed and many others. Can you talk about the movement that is now this right-left alliance on criminal justice reform?
Yeah, so I think, no one group is going to solve this issue. It's such a big issue, and it's such a systemic issue, right? There's many components of this. We can't just let people out of prison and call it a day. There's a reason that people ended up in prison in the first place. We've got to address those systemic issues: mental health, addiction, lack of opportunity, racism. We've got to address those issues in our communities first and foremost. But the way we're going to get there is working through these coalitions, right? We need, take Pennsylvania for an example, we need those legislators to vote yes. And like Jordan said, he's one of a few Democrats up there. There's a lot of Republicans. Now, how impactful do you think it would be if, me, bleeding heart Democrat, goes up there and says, hi, Mr. Republican, I need you to vote for this. He doesn't care, right? I'm never going to vote for him. He doesn't care. I'm not speaking the same language as him. I'm not speaking to those points that Representative Harris spoke to about fiscal impact or about the fact that this is impacting other communities. I'm just up there saying this isn't fair, right? So you've got to have a lot of different voices. You've got to have a lot of different perspectives. In Pennsylvania, we're lucky. There's a phenomenal coalition there: Justice Action Network, FAM, ACLU, and American Conservative Union, working on the same issue. AFP, there's great groups on the grounds. There's also a very important other member of the coalition, or other members of the coalition, and I would actually say these are the most important members, and those are the people with lived experience. Those are the people who, like I did just a few minutes ago, are willing to walk in and share their stories and put a human face to some of these statistics. You prattle off statistics. I can't in my wildest dreams imagine 7 million people lined up. That's just not fathomable for me. But when you start seeing the faces of these folks and you start hearing what happened to them before and after their incarceration, it totally changes that narrative. So I would say that coalitions are the only way that we're going to be able to accomplish any real change.
Well, listen, I agree with that. And coming back around to you, Mendoza, part of the thing, by the way, one of my favorite groups that you guys have been working with in Pennsylvania is FAM. FAM is Against Mandatory Minimum. So it's like, if you literally have, it's impossible to imagine all the Freedom Works and all these Faith and Freedom, you have all these different groups that are as far right as you can be and as far left as you can be. You say, how is that possible? My view on it is, it's the best people in both parties who care. If you are truly strong conservative, principled conservative, you believe in limited government, you believe in individual dignity, and you believe in fiscal responsibility. Well, if those are your principles, this is an outrage, what's going on. Because individual dignity is being run over every day. This is a massive, failed government bureaucracy that's gobbling up money, gobbling up liberties, gobbling up rights with no accountability. If you are a true conservative, without all the other stuff mixed into it, this is your issue. And you're seeing that begin to happen. At the same time, if you're a true Democrat, true progressive, the idea of justice, for the oppressed, the underdog, that's our stuff. And it's literally a shame, it's a stench in the nostrils of God, the way the Democratic Party has been complicit for 30 years in building all these prisons. And so the best Democrats are coming out and saying, we got to stop, this is wrong. We got to stop purchasing the right to be liberal on every other issue by being tough on crime. I'm going to be liberal on every issue, but I'm tough on crime. And that was the formula, which means the Democrats were building prisons to look moderate while they were liberal. That's got to stop. So you have now the best of the Democrats, the best Republicans coming together, working together. And I think it's a positive thing. I think it's a very positive thing. That said, the issues are not easily known and understood by people who have not lived them. And it's so important, from my point of view, for directly impacted people, whether it's family members like Jessica, or people coming home like yourself, or people behind the bar still, to be in a leadership position, to be shaping the narrative, to be actually saying, no, you think this is the issue? No, this is really the issue. How important is it from your point of view, and as we get you to some of the great work that you've been able to do, but how important is it from your point of view to have directly impacted people driving these conversations and driving this movement?
I think it's critically important, man. Being on parole, I grew really, really tired of my situation, of being hopeless, of having a very difficult time finding a job and going to school because of the barriers, whether it was the 50-mile radius or the length of time. So what I did was I went back to school. I went to San Francisco State University. I earned my BA degree in political science. And in 2017, I wrote the language to the first bill in California on parole. I couldn't stand that. And the language was based on my experience, based on how the 50-mile radius is such a huge barrier. And what I was trying to do is improve the opportunities for people who are on parole. By saying if you go to school and earn an AA degree or a BA degree or just a GMT, you can earn some time off of your parole. If you volunteer in your community and do great things by volunteering for an organization, you will be able to travel beyond the 50-mile radius and extra 25 miles every year by showing that you're successful in re-entering back into society. And most importantly, being able to successfully earn an earlier discharge with the good work that you're doing just gives so many people an incentive, something to look forward to, and something to earn while they're out here doing the good work. But it goes to those who do the good work after coming home and put in the time and effort to go above and beyond their conditions of parole.
Yeah, but what you're describing just seems so almost obvious in that you can't just have sticks. You can't just say, I'm gonna, I'm gonna trail you, nail you, and jail you. I'm the referee, I got whistle in my mouth. When you do something wrong, I'm gonna blow it and put you in prison. All sticks, no carrots. You're describing a much more sane system where if you are doing the right thing, you'll be rewarded. If you're doing the wrong thing, there's consequences. But if you're doing the right things, there should be consequences as well. Was this a tough argument to make? Because hearing you say it, how can somebody say no? Talk to us about somebody speaking from a personal experience and the impact of that on lawmakers and decision makers.
For the last 2 years, it's been difficult to pass that bill because of those hard conversations with people who still don't see us as human beings enough to earn these carrots, if you will. Having these conversations of, well, you're on lifetime parole. Why should you get off sooner? Well, because I'm doing the best I can. I've earned my BA degree. I have a job. I'm self-sufficient. I'm self-reliant. And if you're going to make me wait more than a decade or 5 years, it's going to make it a lot harder on my chances to successfully reintegrate. And so it's hard to really humanize our experiences when people still see us as the same thing, a parolee, a felon. And so it's our successes that we really want people to see so that we can make these changes, so we can get buy-in, so people can see that we're creating a safer community by supporting these bills. So it's something that we're definitely working on to make sure that we have more success stories, that we show that people can be successful under this system where they can look at what's ahead and reach out for it with all their force.
And how much of this is about pointing out what we actually want is peaceful streets, thriving communities, safe communities, communities at work, and you actually probably have more insight about what it would take. I mean, you're the expert. I mean, it's so, what you're describing is so insane. You're literally there's not going to be a better expert on how to make the system work better than you, somebody who's not been on probation, who's not been on parole, who's sitting in an office someplace, gets himself a chance to decide. How did you get off a lifetime parole? Because you're still alive.
Still alive. Barely. I've been home for 5 years. And 3 months ago, I was discharged from parole because of those things that I did. But then you have to let me off. Most people don't get off because they're on lifetime parole. You can be kept on lifetime parole for the rest of your life. But it was really the support that I've had by many organizations that provide support to those who are formerly incarcerated and the opportunities. So it was a big accomplishment, but like I said, we need to do more. We need to actually get rid of the lifetime parole, shorten it by showing that people can succeed and do good things.
I want to come back to you, Representative Harris. You know, you got a bill right now, Smart Probation Act in Pennsylvania. We've been complaining and humanizing and complaining, but you're the problem solver. You're the deal guy. What are some of the elements in a bill that would fix some of this stuff that you're passionate about?
Sure. So in Pennsylvania, we have two bills. We have a House bill and a Senate bill. Senate bill is with my colleagues, Republican Cameron Bartolotta and Senator Anthony Williams, and in the House is myself and my partner in reform, Representative Delaney, and Representative Mike Jones and Ed Gainey. And what we're looking to do is, one, is flip how we do technical violations. So if a person, a probation officer wants to violate somebody, before you can send them to jail, we want a judge to be able to decide whether the action is actually a violation or not. Now, this is different than a new crime. If you commit a new crime, you get a new charge, that's something totally different. But we're talking about the interactions with the police. We're talking about, you know, the being late to probation and all of those, you know, technical things that are not dangerous to society. We want a judge to have opportunity to decide before we send somebody to jail and make them sit for a hearing. That's the first thing. The other thing is, we want to look at a system of capping how long a person can be on probation in Pennsylvania in the first place. We're looking at 3 years for misdemeanors and 5 years for felonies. And the way we're looking at doing it is, you know, there will be a presumption that if you have met your requirements and you haven't had any issues, that at that time period there will be a presumption that your probation will terminate. And in order to keep a person on, a judge and or district attorney would have to prove why that person would need to stay on probation. And in addition to that, we're looking at what we're calling earned time credit, which is if you do certain things like get a degree or get a professional license or whatnot, how do we cut some of that time off? You know, the bottom line for us is, you know, we need to be spending our supervision resources on those who actually need to be supervised. So we're also looking at how do you step down certain supervision. So if you've been doing well for a year or a year and a half or whatnot, you have a few more years, how do we step down? So maybe instead of seeing your probation officer every week or every month, now it's quarterly or bi-monthly or whatnot. How do we, you know, start to step down supervision? I mean, we've been working, Democrats and Republicans together, to see what are the consensus points so that we can actually redesign our system so people remain safe, but also that we're being a good steward of the taxpayer dollars, and that we're, you know, bringing families and putting families back together.
You know, one of the things is that, you know, this issue I think for people when they first hear about, oh, there's mass incarceration, what is that? You know, maybe they see the Khalif Browder situation, or they watch the Free Meek documentaries, they see some of Ava DuVernay stuff, you know, the 13th. It seems like it's an overwhelming thing. Like you kind of cut the lights on, it's, oh my God, there's like so many tough, awful things going on. And yet, when I hear you talk, you're identifying, and you as well, Mendoza, specific things that, if they were put in place, would have tremendously positive outcomes, save money, and make folks safer. And so, to me, that's the hope of this movement, right? Is that you're actually, you know, at the end of the day, it's not about the protest, it's not about the being woker than now, it's not about the rah-rah. At a certain point, at a certain point, these were bills and laws and decisions and rules and regulations that were put in place by human beings. And it's almost to me like if you go to a restaurant and you order some takeout, and you go home, and you put the takeout in the refrigerator, and you forget about it for 2 months. When you open it back up, it's not going to look like food. These laws have been by human beings, new rules by human beings to redesign the system. I want to give you that credit and give you a chance to respond to it because, in the situation that we're in, a real problem solver with real solutions and real skill is just very, very rare. But am I correct? Am I depicting what you're doing?
So I appreciate that, but I'm not even that smart. I ain't even afraid. I am the beneficiary of a lot of great folks who help us get this work done. I mean, Jessica, and there's Jenna over at the Justice Action Network. I have friends over at an organization called Community Legal Services down in Philadelphia. They are the grassroots community group that represents people who can't afford lawyers, right? They're the ones who see people every day that are stuck in these situations, and they come up with the solutions. All I do is take what they tell us will work, right, and try to find other people who are going to agree, and then try to use our political leverage and our political will to get it done. But the truth of the matter is, in order for any of us to get this work done, Democrats or Republicans, the first thing we have to do is see the humanity in the people that we're talking about. It is easy to put that food in the refrigerator and close that door and leave it there for 2-3 months or 2-3 years or 2-3 decades when you don't believe in the humanity in the person that you're talking about. So at the end of the day, we have to start seeing people, black, brown, white, rich, whatever. We have to see the humanity in each and every one of them. Because when you see that humanity in them, then you care about what's happening to them in this system. You care about their children. You care about their parents. You care about them. And it gives us the opportunity and the ability to put aside our political affiliations, right, to actually do something that could change the system. At the end of the day, for me, I just want us to fix a problem in a system that has been flawed for so long. It really meant this, and this is the last thing I'll say about this. I've been blessed in life. I had a mother, father, a grandmother, who fought like hell for me in every way. And I was able to go to certain schools because they fought for them, right? And because of that, I have a seat in the State House of Representatives in Pennsylvania, right? Great. But what's not great is the fact that a few months ago, I was in a prison, and I saw a young lady who I went to middle school with, who's from my same neighborhood. And because of the lack of opportunity, I'm in the State House, and she's in a state prison. That doesn't make me feel good. It makes me seem like I'm so great. It makes me wonder what happened in the system to fail that ended her up there when we started in the same place. When you see a person's humanity, you don't just think about what they did, you think about why it happened, and you try to prevent it from happening again. That's what happens when you really want to redesign the criminal justice system so that you actually get to the root of the problem. And I'm not saying we're going to let everybody out, because those homies right now that's in my neighborhood that's shooting up my community, they got to go. They need a timeout. I want them out because I want my folks to be able to go to the store and not have to worry about getting gunned down. But all of those other people who are not a threat to our society, who could be in our communities, we have to find out what happened, why it happened, and how can we fix the system so that they can come back home and be productive citizens. And as I tell my conservative friends all the time, so they can go from tax burden to taxpayer.
Jessica, I want to come to you, and we're getting close to the end, but I want to come to you because, we do have now, I think, the opportunity to think about a second step. That's a big part of why we're here. You play such a strong role, along with many others, Freedom Works, American Conservative Union, FAM, and so many other groups, but you played a very strong role in getting the First Step Back done. And as a result of that, by the way, we don't talk enough about the numbers. People say, the First Step Back, that was just some PR stunt, who cares, blah, blah, blah. Numbers matter. Donald Trump signed that bill December 21st. It's not Halloween yet. 7,000 people have come home based on that. That's a lot of people, 7,000 people. Many of them came home just a little bit earlier than they would, but some would never coming home. So not all of them have been able to come home and stay home, but the vast majority have. So you got 7,000 people going to be home for Thanksgiving that wouldn't have been home. That's very, very special. Also, when you add up all the time that was restored, in other words, this person's sentence got cut, this person's sentence got cut, this person's sentence got, they had double like they got sent home. You start adding up the numbers. The numbers are kind of shocking. Somebody mentioned Christianity. I'm a Christian. Jesus died 2,000 years ago. 115,000 years of human freedom have been restored by the First Step Act. Say that again. 115,000 years of human freedom have been restored. That's when people came home and got their sentences reduced. So it's a really big breakthrough. The New York Times says the most substantial breakthrough federal criminal justice in a generation, because every other bill is going the wrong way for too long, and we started getting some good ones, and this was a good one. But everybody knows it's not enough. And so, as we think about second steps, part of the second step is getting probation and parole to stop just chewing up people's lives. That's a big revolving door back into the system. We've talked about that a little bit. But it's bigger than just that. There's a whole reentry situation, a whole bunch of other opportunities. As you look out the landscape now, what do you think, Jessica, we should be thinking about in terms of second steps?
Yeah, first I gotta correct you, it's 155,000 years. So
oh, wow.
I'll say it twice because you said it twice, 155,000 years. So, which is a lot of years. And I was really happy yesterday. I was standing in line. I met another man who had come home from First Step Act. We had several of the First Step Act beneficiaries here with us yesterday. I think some are here. Jerome Brown, I think, somewhere. Today, and it's just incredible, to see them come home, say hello to their families, and roll their sleeves up and dive into this work. And I've been really excited to see them leading the way, because so many of them have come home and said, I left my friend inside, I left my brother inside, I left this really nice guy who was my cellmate, inside, and now we got to do something to bring them home. So there's a lot of energy for the second step. I think one of the things that we need to do at this point is take a look at our system and why we're sending people into prisons and jails in the first place. Again, it starts with, the underlying factor why they committed a crime. Was it addiction? Was it poverty? Was it mental health? What was that issue? Why are we not fixing for those issues? Well, I can tell you, having been on the city council, a big part of it is our local communities aren't on board yet. I didn't have a drug rehab treatment center in my city. We fought just to get housing for teachers and police. We didn't have transitional housing for people coming home from prisons or jails. You look at the mental health aspect. There's still so much stigma around mental health. So we have to start solving for some of these local solutions. I think there was a bill this year that Cut 50 passed, Aaron Haney wrote and helped pass, who's here in the audience, that diverts parents from going to jails or prisons or getting criminal records, which are going to hold them back for the rest of their life in the first place.
Say more about so if a parent breaks the law, what happens?
Then the court would look at them and figure out why. Why did you commit that crime, right? Before I take you out of your house and ruin your children's lives, force them into foster care, can we get you back on track? Can we get you the opportunity you need, the support you need to succeed? Yes, you have to take accountability. That's very important. You take accountability for your actions, and then let's figure out how we get you back on track. So it's a diversion program, a parental diversion program. Now we know 80% of the women who are in prisons and jails are mothers. Imagine growing up without your mom, right? I couldn't have made it in this world without my mom. So, I think it's important that we start looking at who we're sending to prison, why we're sending them to prison, how can we do everything possible to keep from sending somebody to prison or jail, and how can we set up some of the structures in our local communities so that people succeed in the first place, so that we're preventing crime and having safer communities.
Good. You know, another aspect of this is just this need for people to come home and have jobs. This need for people to come home and get employment. Obviously, Representative Harris, your clean slate legislation is a big step in that direction. I'd just like to get from Jessica, can you just talk about the challenge of re-entry? Because probation and parole reform to me is a part of this idea of re-entry, or just what I call homecoming. When we say re-entry, it seems kind of weird to me. I'd say we should be in the homecoming business. We should be in the welcome home business. And that's a part of it, but it's a bigger challenge. Can you talk about that? And I'm going to give Representative Harris the last one.
Well, I'm not as qualified as Michael to talk about this, but I will say, you know, one of the things we're seeing with some of the people who are coming home under First Step Act, I met Catherine Toney, who was the first woman who came home from the First Step Act. And first thing she said to me, of course she was grateful, she was excited to be home with her daughter, who she had left at 14 years old, and her granddaughter, who she had never really gotten to know. But she was living on their couch because she didn't have access to housing, right? And if they had found out in that apartment building that she was having to live on the couch, the daughter, the granddaughter, and Catherine might have gotten kicked out because she had a felony on her record. She didn't have a car. Her probation office was 20 minutes away. And every single day at 10 a.m., because she had a drug crime 16 years before, she had to call into probation, and randomly they might select her to come in for a drug test. Well, she doesn't have a car to get 20 minutes away. She can't be in a car with anybody who has a conviction. Her daughter is at work because she's the only breadwinner. What is she supposed to do? How could you possibly succeed in that situation? Of course, now she went and got a job. She worked at Walmart. Now she's working at a shrimp packing company. That was what helped her turn her entire situation around, because then she could afford a car, she could afford housing, she could afford food and contribute to her granddaughter and her daughter. If we don't have those basic necessities in place, a place to sleep at night that you're safe and take a shower before you go to work, a place to work, to have a job, to have purpose, to bring home an income, as well as counseling to get through the trauma of being incarcerated, those kind of things, people can't succeed, and it's not fair for us to think that there's any way they could.
Well said. Mendoza, you want to add to that, or underscore?
No, I think that was a great assessment of what most folks come home and re-enter to, and lack of housing specifically. We definitely need to fix housing opportunities for more people coming home.
So there's probation and parole reform, there's housing, there's jobs as a whole. When you put this many people in the land of the free, we take away this much freedom, this many people, it's a whole society that has to recover from that. It's all of our jobs, employers, educators, houses of worship, everybody has to be a part of this massive homecoming project for people who, whatever they did, what we're doing to them is not making it better. And so we've got to be a part of that. Representative Harris, I'd like to just give you the opportunity as the only lawmaker on the panel. We got a lot of people here who are who are either lawmakers or want to become lawmakers all day long. But as we let you wrap this up, any words of advice or encouragement to people in this audience who want to make a difference, either running for office or not?
The first thing I'll say is thank you for being here. I mean, the truth is, this is a forum of folks who are running for the highest office in our country, and the whole forum is around criminal justice reform. So we can get confused about a whole lot of other things, but let's not get confused about the fact that these days are to talk about what like I said before, is the civil rights issue of our time at the highest level. So the first thing is thank you for everyone who had the foresight that we had to come to this place to have this conversation. What I would say is one of the biggest supporters that we've had in this fight for justice reform in Pennsylvania is the Chamber of Business and Industry. And if we don't have an economic part to what we're doing in reform, people are going to go back to prison. It's just that simple. Because as much as someone wants to stay home and do the right thing, when they got 3 kids at home crying, they got to find a way to feed their family, right? Many of us may have not been in that situation, but I do understand When you got these kids crying, you got to feed them. People look for ways to do it. So it's not just about cleaning up their records. It's not just about getting them home and watching the supervision, but it's also about what do we now do as the government, right, to help connect them with employers in different sectors that they can work. And one of the things that I hear from business owners all the time is that some of their best workers are some of the brothers and sisters who have criminal records. So when we see their humanity and we remove the stigma of their incarceration and we help them economically and help them get back on their feet, then all of us can take pride in the fact that we've redesigned a system that keeps us safe and that is about rehabilitation, not retaliation.
National Black Caucus of Local Elected Officials is the oldest black caucus in the world, consisting of mayors, council, all over. Mayor Pete Buttigieg, he belongs to the generation that came of age with school shootings, the generation that provided the majority of the troops for the conflicts after 9/11, the generation that is on the business end of climate change, and a generation that, unless we take action, stands to be the first to be worse off economically than their parents. Pete is laying out a vision, values, and policies that ensure that America's future is better than his previous years. We need to secure a future for which every American has the freedom to live a life of their choosing, where our republic grows more and not less democratic, where racial justice is a lifestyle and not a dream. We've put an end to this endless war, where we've summoned the national will to meet the challenge of climate change, where everyone has the health care that they need, where everyone has a chance to find purpose and belonging in their economy and in our country. Ladies and gentlemen, I will introduce to you and present to others Mayor Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, to Keither and your leadership in local government. I think we'd be well served if national government resembled the best in local government instead of the other way around. And I appreciate what you are doing. In the same vein, I want to thank my fellow mayor, Steve Benjamin, a leader within the community of mayors. And I want to thank everyone who made this event possible, in particular Benedict College and its students for the hospitality here. And I'm honored to be with passionate reformers, activists, and advocates today. And given the conversation that's going on these last 24 hours or so here, I'm particularly looking forward to a serious discussion about what it would be like to have a president who is actually committed to criminal justice reform. I'm looking forward to a discussion about how we can do better than a president who calls for death for the Central Park Five, refuses to apologize even after they are exonerated, and then proposes to resume the death penalty at the federal level. If we're serious about criminal justice reform, we can do a lot better than that. We need a president who can do better than encourage police officers to rough up and not, quote, be too nice to those that they encounter. We can do better. And we can damn well do better than a president who compares his own impeachment, a constitutional process he brought on himself, to lynching, which, just to be very clear, is a pattern of white supremacist terrorism, and claims that his supposedly unfair treatment gives him insight into the criminal justice system. It means he does not understand what reform is about. Because it is about justice, it is about wealth, and it is about power. And his story is the story of somebody born into wealth, benefiting from the power that comes with that, using that to accumulate further wealth, who has now used that to gain power. He has abused that power, and he will be held accountable. It could not be more different than the situation of millions of Americans who were denied wealth, denied access, and inheritance that is so important in our economy through the generational theft that began with slavery but has continued over time, have been denied power and have had power asserted over them by means of poverty and by means of suppression. So, in order to explain why I am running for president and why my presidency would be different, I want to ask you to picture what it's going to be like that first day when Donald Trump is no longer the president of the United States. I want you to really picture it. Now, there's always first a sense of relief and a murmur of approval when I paint that picture, right? What it's going to be like that first day, because this presidency is going to come to an end one way or the other. And it'll be relief to move past the chaos and the corruption, but really think about what this country is going to be like that day. We will be even more torn up and polarized as a country than we are right now. The sun will be coming up over a country still facing the crises and the challenges that have brought us to this point. They did not take a vacation for the Trump presidency or for the impeachment process. The sun will come over a country that is approaching the point of no return when it comes to our climate. It will come up over an economy where millions of Americans cannot get ahead and where opportunity is still not equal. The sun's going to come up over a nation beset by a gun violence epidemic that is stealing lives in our houses of worship, in our schools, and on the streets of cities like mine every day. And our next president has to be prepared to offer a vision that is bold enough to take on those problems and capable of unifying the American people. So I'm running to be the president who can pick up the pieces of our divided nation and help put it back together. And we cannot do that without meaningful criminal justice reform. When our system is as unequal as it is now, with racism so firmly embedded in its foundations, we cannot really call it a justice system at all. Now, the First Step Act was a solid first step. But if the president thinks he ought to get an award for signing it, let's pause to acknowledge the leadership of people like Congressman Hakeem Jeffries in putting that bill together. And yes, that also means acknowledging the leadership of my friend and competitor, Senator Cory Booker, who made that happen, along with all of his House and Senate colleagues. Whether you have a courtroom that doesn't provide adequate defense or a classroom where minor infractions are leading to major punishments, we still see a system that inflicts and reflects and compounds injustice. And South Carolina knows this all too well. Despite making up less than 30% of the overall population, here in South Carolina, black citizens account for more than 60% of the incarcerated population. And for those who have served their time and are looking to get back on their feet, state policies compound federal policies, like the exclusion from support for housing, education, and health, all but pushing people back into a cycle of incarceration. I come at these issues from the perspective of a mayor of a diverse city who has seen how the shadow of our nation's history of racism complicates every dimension of our lives, from housing to health, from education to economic empowerment, from access to justice to access to the ballot. I also come at this shaped by my own story and search for belonging. Everyone's experience of exclusion in this country is different. I have not had the experience of being more likely to be pulled over or less likely to be called back for a job interview because of a stereotypically black name, or less likely to be believed when describing symptoms of pain, as has been shown to be the case for black women in clinical environments today. But I do have a propulsion to act on these issues from my own very different experience, because I do have a memory of knowing the war that can break out in the heart of a young person who realizes that a basic fact about him could dictate his future. Could mean that he will be feared, will be hated, will be subject to random violence, will be denied opportunity. And I also know something of the amazing power of activism and advocacy, solidarity and alliance. Because as someone who knows what it's like to see your rights come up for debate in the political square, somebody whose marriage exists by the grace of a single vote on the United States Supreme Court, I have an understanding of why political decisions matter, why politics matters. It matters because the decisions they make in those big white buildings flow into our families and our communities, our workplaces, even our marriages and our lives. And I come at this issue as an American, having put my life on the line for this country, reflecting on our history and realizing that of all the forces that have come close to actually destroying this country, of all our enemies, foreign and domestic, the one that actually came nearest to ending America is white supremacy. It happened during the Civil War, and I believe that if we do not destroy white supremacy in our lifetime, it could well destroy the American project in our lifetime. Lastly, I come at this as a person of faith, mindful of the scripture that says that we are to always remember those who are imprisoned as though we were in prison next to them. And I believe that has implications, even as somebody who believes that when you are in office, you serve people of every religion and of no religion equally. We are called to do better. And the idea of the Douglas Plan for Black America that I have put forward rests on the knowledge that it is not enough to replace a racist policy with a neutral policy and expect justice to find its way forward on its own. We have to bring intention, as much intention and resources as we brought into the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, but this time it needs to be invested right here at home to deal with the issue of systemic racism before it constrains this entire nation. And that is not only a matter of criminal justice, because the black experience in America is not just about criminal justice, but we know how much we've got to do when it comes to criminal justice. To cut incarceration in half, which we can do by ending incarceration for drug possession offenses and eliminating mandatory minimums. And at the state level, doubling funding for decarceration efforts and incentivizing states to process evidence backlogs to prevent people from languishing in jail while they have not even been given the chance to see the results. And with over 43,000 young people behind bars on any given day, we are going to place a big emphasis on overhauling the juvenile justice system. We're going to provide $100 million in grants to states to close youth prisons and repurpose them to serve the needs of children. We're going to ensure better conditions for people while incarcerated and better opportunity when released. And when I am president, we will end the use of prolonged solitary confinement because it is torture, and the United States does not torture. We will demonstrate that we understand basic human decency, from making sure people can make phone calls to loved ones without being gouged by someone seeking a profit, to ensuring that we offer free women's hygiene products to women who are incarcerated. Supporting a real shot at a second chance, restoring Pell Grant access to the incarcerated, and banning the box, because incarceration should not only be about detention, it should be about redemption, and people should be able to get back on their feet when they leave. Finally, we've got to improve police training and accountability. The pain that followed the death of Eric Logan in my own city and the almost weekly news of violent encounters from around the country show us what is at stake in ensuring that policing is known to be just and accountable in every community. That means more transparency, standardizing data reporting, a red flag system, and a better pipeline for national service so that we can have the best kinds of police officers, which is why I'm proposing that we develop a national police academy along the line of the U.S. service academies, which will offer a 4-year college degree in policing that includes an emphasis on things like de-escalation and civil rights. And we will raise the legal standard under which officers are expected to demonstrate if they are justified in using lethal force and promote legislation to end qualified immunity so that accountability truly is equal for all. There's a lot more in there than I can describe in a set of comments, so I would invite you to visit PeteForAmerica.com to learn more, and I'm looking forward to having a discussion now about what is at stake and what we can do. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to be with you today.
Good afternoon. My name is Eddie Melton. I'm State Senator of Indiana representing Gary, Maryville, Hobart, Crown Point, Lake Station, and New Chicago. Thank you. All right. I have the unique honor and pleasure of interviewing my friend and colleague and fellow Hoosier here today. So let's join in a very robust conversation. Looking forward to hearing from you today.
Sounds good.
All right. So, Mayor, first off, I just want to congratulate you on much success. There's so many Hoosiers across the state extremely proud of you and honored to see you on the national stage and addressing very critical issues. Today, we want to have a discussion on a variety of topics in regards to criminal justice reform. I was recently in South Bend a couple of days ago, and individuals spoke to me about various concerns and issues. I know as mayor, you've witnessed and you've seen a variety of things take place. You mentioned in your remarks in terms of the death of Eric Logan in South Bend at the hands of a police officer. What did you learn from that experience? And as president, what policies would you implement to address this on a national level?
Well, the biggest thing that we learned in the aftermath of this police shooting, which is being investigated to this day, I called for an independent investigation and it's running its course, but what we realized is we didn't have to wait for that in order to act. What we know is that all of these issues are connected, and beyond what happened in an individual incident, part of why there's such anguish in a community when this happens is that it ties to a greater sense of fear and a wall of mistrust between communities of color, especially the black community, and those who are sworn to serve them. We also know that it's not only about policing, it's about economic empowerment too. And so we're working all of these things at once. We set up a community process where individuals concerned about policies had a chance not only to learn about them, but actually give their input to consider changing the policies on things like the use of force, the way body cameras are used in the city. We have them, but they did not serve us well in this case. How recruiting works, because we've got to have a more diverse police department, and this has been a real challenge for departments across the country. And making sure that we have the right standards for accountability and officer discipline. And we've been able to make it into an empowering experience for people who are concerned and need to continue in that direction, because these things need to be managed out in the open. There's got to be transparency in order to have accountability. But the other thing we learned, as I said, is everything is connected. And so we are stepping up our efforts to make sure that the city is doing business, for example, with businesses owned by minorities. We've been working on this for years, but we've been able to hit the next level this year because of some research that gives us the legal foundation to set goals. And by the same token, nationally, I'm proposing we set goals for 25% of the federal government's business to be done with businesses owned by those who've been historically excluded, because we know there is a connection between economic disempowerment and the fact that people of color are more likely to be encountering the criminal justice system. We have to take every piece together. It's true locally. It's even more true nationally.
Right. So as president, what can a president do? Being a mayor, having experience, seeing these situations, what would you do day one to address these issues?
So much. So I mentioned a few of them here. Things like setting up a different standard around policing, making sure that the federal system is leading the way toward decarceration. Look, there's still this myth that locking people up makes us safe. We are the most locked up country in the world, and we are certainly not the safest. So there is every piece of evidence that cutting incarceration in half will make America safer. One of the things we see in South Bend, and I know your community has been affected by this too, is a generation of youth who have experienced the incarceration of a parent, which is right alongside the experience of violence as a young person in terms of something that can make somebody more likely to have issues in their own life later on. Incarceration that did more harm than the offense that it was intended to address. That's why we need to end mandatory minimums. It's why we need to end incarceration as a response to drug possession. Another thing that I didn't have a chance to mention in my comments, but I think is important, is that we review and learn from these incidents over and above the justice process. So when there is an incident, especially an incident of police violence, that turns out to be murder, as has happened case after case, then of course there needs to be justice there. But also, a lot of cities have built models where they treat every incident that happens from an issue around a demonstration to a police shooting as a learning opportunity. And just like we have a National Transportation Safety Board that figures out what happens when there's a plane crash, we need a national incident review board, I believe, that's not about assigning blame. That happens at the accountability level directly. But is about leading to more policies and changes that need to happen in the aftermath of these incidents.
Right. You mentioned the youth aspect to this. You know, in Indiana, we're not fully funding our schools the best way we should be. The school-to-prison pipeline system that we're seeing across the country, in particular in communities like Gary, like South Bend, Indiana, we see a significant amount of Black and Latino students being expelled from school for minor offenses. How do we address that issue? And as president, what type of policies would you implement to say, how do we turn the tide in terms of students being expelled from school?
Yeah, this really needs leadership from the top, because what we see is the same incident leads to an overreaction, suspension that then leads to detention, and then you get into this youth justice system, if we can call it that. Certainly it's a youth incarceration system that tends to perpetuate these problems. It sends a message to young people that we don't believe that they're going to go anywhere but prison. And it is that psychological violence as well as the procedural problems that are such a big deal. But we can make a difference. How? Well, first of all, incentivizing the right kind of relationship between police and students. When we have something like a police athletic league, where relationships are being formed, that's part of how we can inspire students to grow up and become police officers. But when police presence in schools leads to over-policing, leads in some cases to violence, we've got to look at how these programs are structured, and we should not be funding ones that tend to contribute to a school-to-prison pipeline. We've also got to promote alternative to incarceration programs at the juvenile level. And we've got to treat kids like kids. The brain is still being developed, and we have got to raise the age at which youth can be tried as adults and end the practice of life imprisonment for people who are not even fully formed into the people they're going to be.
All right. You brought up kind of the over-policing in schools. What are your thoughts on resource officers? Do you see it as a benefit? Do you see it as a pro or a con? What are your thoughts on that?
It's really problematic. Look, I don't mean to paint a broad brush. I have seen cases where resource officers believe in the kids and they view themselves as mentors, but more often than not, there is the risk of them basically being treated as armed guards, not guarding the kids, but policing the kids. And that's where it goes off the rails. So we need to review all of the SRO programs that get federal funding. And if they show evidence of having that effect, then they just should not be getting federal support.
Right. You know, we talk about youth, we talk about the entire gambit. I have a lot of friends that have driven without driver's license. And this is a significant issue, especially for those that may have had an offense that requires that the state take their driver's license away from them, which prohibits them from either going to a job, prohibits them from going to school, healthcare. Many of our communities are transportation deserts, where we don't have adequate transportation services. What would you do as president in terms of addressing the current ability for states to take away individuals' driver's license?
It's such an important point, and we need to change this policy because it's almost ordering people back into the justice system. In South Bend, some of the people that we have worked with, we do one event called a call-in with people who are really at risk of being involved in violent crime, but we think if we can get them a job, would want to and be ready to change. And there's about an hour where they hear a message from law enforcement as well as faith leaders. And when I attend, I usually stand kind of by the door, so they head for the door afterwards. We make sure there's food, and we try to stop and talk. And when you talk to these young men, they're almost always men, who are working or have a chance to find work, it's usually in Elkhart, which is about an hour away from our city, or 45 minutes. Good jobs, good manufacturing jobs there. But if they don't have a license or they can't get their license cleared up, it's incredibly hard for them to get that job. We see it in South Carolina, where so many black youth are in rural areas that are these transportation deserts. First of all, we got to do something about making sure that we have better public transportation so that you're not always depending on an unreliable cousin with an unreliable car. Right. And that's one missed shift away from you getting fired. Yeah. But also make sure that we don't create barriers to being able to get your license. And this is just one of the many ways in which being incarcerated is expensive. We pile on more and more costs, and people sometimes make pennies an hour when they're working while incarcerated, making license plates or different things. And meanwhile have denied the opportunity to get Pell Grants for education, have a Medicaid exclusion, so there's no continuity of care between when you're in and when you're out, which is a huge challenge for people with addiction. Right. And when you do get out, you can't get Section 8 housing. When we know that access to safe and stable housing is one of the best predictors for whether somebody who is released is going to make it. So all of these, in addition to what you're talking about with the license issue, have to change. Now, the government can't dictate it because it's a state decision, right. But there's a lot of carrots and there's a lot of sticks that you can offer from federal policy. And we should link federal funding to states having an enlightened policy on making sure that people get the chance to drive.
That's good. You mentioned call-ins. And there's a program that I know that the city of Gary, our mayor, implemented called Gary for Life. I think it's the same similar model that you all have. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how it helps the residents and those that are on that track in terms of incarceration? How does it help the population?
Well, it's based on the knowledge that there are a lot of people who are caught up in group or gang-related violence. It's often the only social cohesion